me. Okay.
So come towards you all. So we're a little more.
So now get that again.
Oh, okay. You're right. It's the other way. Okay. So it's recording now. Okay.
Okay, Brad. Well, it is such a great joy to have this gathering, and I want to thank Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene for being here, and I want to introduce Rekha, who is going to introduce and guide this conversation. So just a really warm thanks for bringing us into this narrative and this discussion today.
All right, well, thank you. In the interest of full disclosure, we're trying to record this so that everyone knows.
There's the camera.
So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Ousmane Power-Greene. Ousmane, as most of you know, is a longtime parishioner here. He's well known to us. He's been a youth leader in the church, and been here since at least 2007, or maybe before. But actually, since 2007, I think that's the right date. He's been a professor at Clark University, and he's currently associate professor and head of the Africana Studies there. He's already written one very well-regarded book, but we're going to talk about another one today. This is his first foray into fiction, and it's a beautiful work. I hope at least a good portion of you have read it already. It's a real page-turner from my perspective. There's a lot to it, and there are many different layers, and I hope we can delve into this onion of a book. And so what we're going to do is we'll start off with, I think, some remarks by Ousmane, and then we'll continue with some Q&A. So welcome, Ousmane.
So first, I just want to thank everybody, anyone who's purchased this book or somehow got it and actually read it. I don't know if people realized it, but many works of fiction that people work on just don't have the reception that I've been fortunate enough to have with this book. You work on it for a long time, but the reality is that, like, unlike other forms of engaging things that one does, long fiction is one that requires the most time and attention. Right? It requires the most time and attention. I frequently meet people who say to me, I don't like fiction. I like nonfiction. And so I didn't realize that because I started off my life as a writer, writing fiction, actually. My ambitions and dreams were to publish a novel. So this is actually a culmination of my life dream. So I'm going to be serious, y'all. I was in fourth grade. I went to the Young Authors and Illustrators Conference. I was invited to. I wrote a short story. It's in New York. It's a national program. I don't know if we have it in Massachusetts. And I wrote a short story. I was invited to go. I was so thrilled that I got accepted into this conference. I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. And I went to this conference. I went to these different sessions by authors. And one of the sessions, two sessions I'll never forget. One was with Judy Blume. Can you believe that? I went to a fiction writing workshop as a fourth grader with Judy Blume, right? She actually lived in my town. I grew up in Yorktown, New York. And the other nonfiction one I went to was with Alan Alda. Right? Yeah, fourth grade. Right? Obviously had a big impact on me, And so these formative moments as a young writer and thinker, and a person that didn't see themselves as a writer, and but that ambition to want to write stories and to want to share those stories really has been the most consistent. Besides being an NBA player, but besides that, this is the second most consistent sort of occupation or event in my life. The first one didn't work out, but the second one, or the first one, certainly did. And so I'm not joking when I say this is a culmination of a life's work, or at least a life's work engaged in trying to create stories that people will read, that people will find engaging and interesting, and then most importantly, and this is why we're here today, is people want to talk about it. Right? So you write a book, it's like, oh, that was good. It's like, okay, you know what I mean? Like, you want them to say, like, wow, that was interesting. I didn't get that. And this made me mad. Right? This really upset me. Okay? When I first began to do sort of book tours, book events, I had a privilege, huge privilege, to present the Center of Fiction in Brooklyn, New York. When I got invited there, I was like, I can't believe this. Like, you know, again, the dream of having it out, and then getting invited to the Center of Fiction among like real writers. You know, it's like I'm really outside, like first novel, right? And the scholar, as a scholar, was also an author, did the Q&A. And this was like literally my first sort of big event. And she said to me before, she said, I'm going to ask you tough questions, right? And I was like, she's an Afro-Caribbean woman from Trinidad, immigrated here to New York, teaching at Queen for 30 years. And I was like, okay, you know, great. So when we got on stage, she proceeded to ask me questions really pointedly about Ali's decisions. And I was just like sitting here with this, you know, author, novelist, and also intellectual and writer. I should be able to ask her, why would Ali do this? And then this part at the end, why would Ali? I was like myself, like, she actually believes like Ali's a real person. Like she's talking to me as if I'm like, let me just channel Ali for a second. Ali, I started like talking like what Ali's doing. And so that's what I mean, like being provoked, like writing something that would have this person, right, who's a writer and a much more senior writer and scholar than I am, really taking seriously the characters. I mean, it's like incredible. I couldn't believe it, right? As I started trying to fit Ali's decisions, like, well, Ali felt a lot of pressure. Like, it was really an incredible experience. Again, back to this sort of theme of, you know, it's one thing to sort of work on a project, but it's also to engage it, to really take it seriously, and to think about both the, you know, the content, but also the structure and form, which is really important to literature. So let's sort of talk about that for a second, and then, you know, obviously I'm eager to sort of engage all you, but formally speaking, right, the book is divided. And you know, those that have had a chance to sort of look at it and read it, I mean, it's clearly very driven by the Bible, right, in verses. And it's very much structured in a way that would suggest a particular rhythm, right? For those that don't have it, the first part is death, right? The second section is resurrection. Right, sound familiar? Right? The third section is ascension, which those who are not Episcopalians, right, aren't really ascension. Doesn't make sense. What does that mean? Like to ascend? It's not something familiar to them, but to us, of course, right? We know what that, you know. And then redemption, right? Thinking about that. Right? Then we shift to revolution, which is the fifth section, and then revelation. That's what's revelation. Someone, you know, so eventually people start correctly showing, oh, it's actually this and that. I was like, yeah, but you know, the literary critics make you look brilliant. It's like, yeah, but Revelation, it's a play on Revelation. No, it's just, I had the yes. But Revelation, right? So the entire structure of the book is very much driven by, you know, the Bible and sort of me thinking about religiosity and this question of those who are philosophers, right? And then those who are religious figures and sort of thinking about religion, that sort of tension. So Ali Douglas is a philosopher, right? And the villain, the book's title after, Matthew Strong, fashions himself as sort of a philosopher preacher. Right? He is literally a preacher, Sons of Light, and so he sort of is a person who is very interested in ideas and interpretation ideas, right? And so, from a structural point of view, those elements are sort of, you know, and then of course, you know, it's structured on a paragraph, right, in the book. So there is the biblical sort of mark or sort of biblical aspects that are underneath the sort of intros, and then there's a quote, right, by a person who's either a philosopher, a person in history, and that pairing, was really important to me sort of as a structural form, right? So if you just sort of look at those elements, it might tell you, and again, you know, we just got into the story, but it might actually tell you sort of a story about what's happening in the text. People haven't asked me very much about that, the religious aspect, is sort of the theological aspect, or really the philosophical aspect. More the history, that's been more compelling to people, and that's perfectly fine. And you know, part of writing a work that is really very philosophical and really rooted in history, philosophy, and theology is that you put it in a thriller, and then people just go on the ride. And, you know, so, you know, unlike other texts like Michel Foucault, for example, that, you know, some of us may have read, some of us may not have, you know, sort of true James Baldwin. You know, these are thinkers that we wrestle with, we read, right? They're challenging people. Even Anna Julia Cooper, I used to teach it, I still teach part of it, but like, you know, she's a challenging thinker and writer. And so, because, you know, sort of that's there for people are interested, but at the same time, what becomes important to the sort of artistic aspect of the book is the ride, right? The question that starts the novel out, and then how that sort of question is answered throughout the entire novel. And that's, for those who are writers, which I actually know as people in here are writers, you know, for me, that is the central piece that can allow it to move into that realm of like thriller or mystery, right? So when you have any sort of question, you know, the difference between mystery, I learned this actually like recently. Right? Difference between mystery and thriller. Do you spend any time on this at all in our thinking? No. So, what's like the most famous mystery, like sort of mystery writers? Who's the investigator? Agatha Christie, right? Sherlock Holmes, right? These are sort of figures, right? Usually some sort of death happens at the start, right? Something happens, and then the rest of the book is figuring it out. Thrillers, y'all, Dan Brown, familiar with these people, right? You know, thrillers are ticking time bomb, right? So there needs to be something that you are thrilled, it's thrilling and compelling, that will happen if something doesn't happen. So that's basically mystery thriller, right? Again, sort of formal qualities of it. I've actually, with this book, this has been described, not exaggerating, like historical fiction, right? It's like, okay, yeah. Then it's like thriller, I'm like, okay. And then Boston Book Festival, the woman's like, I actually think it's more of a mystery. And I was like, great, right? So, because my response is what? All the writers in here, right? As long as you read it, I don't care what genre it is, right? As long as you read this book, I don't know, call it whatever you want. I know at least one person mentioned they're not interested in horror or gothic or this. That's, again, I'm trying to write books that anyone will pick it up, they get started, and soon they're compelled. Right? They forget that it's a male writing a female character, for example. Right? They forget all that stuff, and they're in the world of the characters. They don't want to stop. They're curious. That's what's important to me, and as opposed to ticking all the boxes. Although I have to say that after the 100th draft, writers go backwards, and then you start putting in things that look smart. So just FYI, like, you know, like some of the gothic elements in here. There's gothic fiction. Do we like gothic or southern gothic at all? We know this stuff. Horror comes sort of out of gothic. But this cemetery, house, haunted house, right? You know, some sort of haunting that happens. It's there. That's in here. Those are the gothic elements of it. So we got thriller, gothic, southern gothic. It happens in the south. Right? There are trees, really haunting. Right, southern gothic. So when I was baking this, when I was writing this, I was actually started by something to me that I was thinking about horror because I've always been interested in horror. And for me, one of the horrific elements of my experience growing up was the Atlanta child murders. Right? I don't know if people remember those in the early 80s. Yes. Right? So for me, when I started working on this, I was interested in this book. That experience for me, like real fear, like not like, because I used to love horror movies growing up and stuff, I love that stuff. But that was the first like really fearful thing because this idea of a racialized, you know, effort. Like it was like black kids are being kidnapped and so like, and that I don't know if that was ever, it was never really figured out. The case was actually reopened. But I remember as a kid that being a formative fear that I had, right? And so for me, my interest in taking on the hard subject matter had to be sort of that idea, because for me personally, it was something that really shaped me and me thinking about myself. My mom told me later that when my father was suggesting college in Atlanta, I was like, oh, no. I won't go to college in Atlanta. I didn't even remember that. My mom told me, I was like, oh, that's the type of impact that had. Right? These sort of horrifying incidents where they sort of shape your experience. And that was one. So one was surrounding that for me and delving into real horror. At the time that I started writing this, it was 07, 08, so it was sort of like around the time of the election and a church burned in Springfield, right? So the idea of like church burnings has a long history in African American history, right? It's a long tradition of white violence, and choosing either a cross, right, or a church to burn is one of the most sort of like, almost cliche in a horrifying way to try to create horror or torment black communities. And so when this happened in Springfield, I sort of wanting to work on a book like this, and it had an impact on me. I mean, really think about the role of sort of religion. At the time I learned about the alt-right, which was new to me, alternative right, and sort of radical right Christianity. These are all things that were new to me. I was sort of thinking about, and I became interested in this character, Matthew Strong, right? This person who really believes absolutely in his ideas, right? He's fervent in his ideas around racist ideas, ideas of white supremacy, seeing it as biblical and historical, meaning that his family goes back in Alabama, owned enslaved people, and that order was a just order to him, and that the rationale around sort of Christianity and slaveholding made perfect sense. And so this character that I sort of was thinking about and working through, this was central to him, right? This was central to him. And so as I started working on sort of thinking about this world, this person, a type of person that would burn a church, you know what I mean? Like, what type of person? Well, I don't get it, but the interest for me as a writer and a historian too, because I write about racial violence, I teach a course on it, has been a person like this and attempting to that. So I started researched and studied these figures, also figures who were professors and also white supremacists, which is a real thing, and people who have actual day jobs or they're professors in universities. And so all of this sort of came together for me in thinking about my character. My heroine, the heroine story, which I knew right away, I knew that I wasn't that interested. I knew y'all weren't that interested in reading just about white supremacists. Right? So I was like, so almost immediately the idea of Allie Douglas, right, this philosopher, right, became very important, right? The pairing the hero, the heroine, and the villain, and pairing them together. And then the process of writing it was thinking about that duality, right? This sort of idea about a person who spends their life with ideas, has a background, right? This sort of activist background and ideas, and then what happens when the thing you write about, you're afraid of, and that's part of why you engage it, what if it came to life? Like, what happened if the character, sort of theoretically, you've been dealing with around violence and horrifying things. What if that person was real, and then what if that person made you the center of their attention? Like, what would happen then, right? As a teacher, as a person that writes all these things, it's horrifying. Do you suddenly become the target of a person who decides that you're the one to narrate their story, or to sort of best, to prove that you're right, in that sort of weird, sick way that some people who are like Matthew Strong are. It's like it really matters that he's right? And so all these questions drove the writing of this and the redrafting of this and the scenes and what's going to happen and when and how. I knew Allie would live, so that was that's something I knew from the beginning. But how would she get away from all of this? We have a person who's so intentional. And so that became really important to me thinking through the novel. One element I wanted to share with you all, because it happened in here. So when I was working on the early drafts of the novel, the characters, those who haven't read it, it's fine, but women end up getting kidnapped, right? These sort of young black women. So I was working with that for a long time, and I had drafts going with them, and I wanted them to have voice. And I was actually in church, here. I was sitting over there. And for whatever reason, I started thinking, my mind's a little thinking about it. And I just realized, like, you know what, actually, all the women are going to live. It just came to me in church. I was like, it's my story. It's my book. You know what I mean? So I was like, just came to me. I was like, wait a second, no, Revelation. Like, I was like, no, actually, in my story, they all live, right? It's fiction, right? Unlike the tragedy that drove writing the story, or those who are familiar with the Take Back the Night movement. Y'all remember that? Take Back? I don't know where it went. What happened? You ever think about that? When I was in college in the 90s, it was like we had Take Back the Night. It was a ceremony. But in Roxbury, part of what inspired a lot of black women activists who had been a part of the Columbia River Collective and its whole history around this in the late 70s was around women who had disappeared and police didn't investigate. And that really inspired some of the early movement. And so I decided in my story, I was like, it's my story, so it's fiction. And so in this space, I had that sort of epiphany perhaps, that to me, what's important is everything else, and them sort of being victims to Matthew Strong. It was not something that I decided was important to it. So hopefully one didn't ruin it for all of you. But if I had you, where you're like, really take me there. I don't know if I can keep reading, but I gotta keep reading. Yes, awesome. Exactly. Because I think that's very unexpected because, again, Southern Gothic or horror, other things, they would do that because, that's just what you do with a story like that. But it wasn't as important. There is, for those that did get to the end, there's a very Christian moment at the end with using a tomb and having the person, the mayor's daughter, right, emerge from the tomb and sort of Allie's connection with her grandmother, and that was really important as well. That came sort of later in constructing the book, but ultimately, all these sort of efforts, all these different iterations of what you have is centered on the basic question about ambition and sacrifice. Right? Ambition and sacrifice. So ultimately, what are any of us willing to sacrifice for our ambition? Right? Be it as philosophers, like Allie Douglas, you think about her family and sort of connection with her community because she's now at some prestigious university in New York, and she's sort of this like famous intellectual, and she's finally been acknowledged for her work, and sort of left behind the activist days, left behind the family. Like, what are you willing to sacrifice, right, to achieve what you see to be the thing that will fulfill you? So that was central to it. And then, of course, the mayor, Tommy Turner, is a crucial character in there, in the novel. And what are you willing to sacrifice? Who are you willing to be supported by? Where are you willing to take money from as a black politician in order to be successful? To achieve something that you say, well, if you have the first black governor, like, isn't that more important? Like, you're like, okay, maybe I got money from, shady people, and maybe I broke this rule or that rule in my path, but isn't this the greater good? Right? All of these things were really important to me as I was writing this book, was just dealing with that. And there are many times when I wasn't sure which way it was going to go. Actually, most of the time, I was like, I'm not sure, let me keep writing. Which way will it go? How will things turn out? Because I haven't figured it out. I had to stop. At some point, the book has to come out. Like, you need to stop with the pondering, with these questions that I certainly did not figure out the answer to. And so maybe I'll end with that, with the questions around ambition and sacrifice, the questions around faith, believing in something you can't see, the question of are you serving the community, or are you not? What does it mean to believe in sort of a religious community, but also an actual community? These are questions that I still am very interested in dealing with, answering, I look forward to continuing on this sort of journey and quest. And thanks for listening to my intro here, and I'll open it up to questions. Thanks.
Great. If we any questions from the audience?
Oh, I don't need a microphone. I thought the book was very skillfully written, and for me, it points up. I mean, those are very, very truthful, skillful things you're talking about. But the fear we have when we address the South, and those inbred feelings that our parents, our grandparents, being white, have had. But I read the book, it just went, it flew by. I just read it very quickly. And I think in fiction, there's a lot of truth. There's more truth in there. And the fact that the villain felt so God-driven, and he could see all of Scripture through why he hated these black people and why he was trying to protect the white race. I mean, there are a lot of racial issues in here that are brought very skillfully through a beautiful story and the very thoughtful protagonist, the woman who is a professor, and how she gets caught in the middle of it. And I kind of wondered, how is this going to end?
Yeah.
But he manages that, and I just recommend it wholeheartedly. There's a lot of truth in this book. Yeah. And I just read Hopes by Geraldine Brooks.
Okay. Yeah.
Same topic.
Yeah.
And these books are treasures for us.
Okay.
Even if you think you've got a handle on it, we still need to learn a lot more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you for your hard work.
You know, I find the idea of the lone writer and the sort of like skillful lone writer to be a myth I have to shatter every time I'm in public. So I just want to say that my mother read at least 2 early drafts, maybe 3, and we went through and looked at the unskillful fobbling of words and concepts and helped it make it better. Ernie Brill, who's here, one of my writing partners and mentors, read about 3 or at least 4, maybe 4 drafts of this, versions of this book. 5? Yeah. Well, this is definitely 5, right? I mean, at least this. My agent was an editor first, and she is a brilliant thinker and reader, really closely because, she helped me a lot with pace. Then I had my editor at Other Press really helped me with pace and challenged me on every word, which actually made me rewrite things to figure out if you're in between, in terms of you need to make it move like this, actually, you need to be decisive because you don't want your reader to be distracted. So when you write, if you write something, right, this is the skill, this is the artistry, right? Because if you have to think or you're taken away, that takes you out of the story. And so if you felt were sucked in, and that is the skill of writing thrillers, that comes from excellent editors who help you, and sort of writers who you write with and friends and family, help clarify and get it so people can move. And you want people to be curious, but if your goal is to make it have a writing style, that's how. So the idea of the individual artist that just writes these, it's it really is the behind the scenes is all of those efforts and questions, and then sometimes saying to people maybe this over here needs to come out, and you fight it no, that scene, I feel like it's so important. If you can just be humble, so back to humility, and just say and just think and be okay, in the grand scheme of what I'm trying to do now, once you choose to sort of make it move, how important is it? And the people you're working with, their only goal is for it to be, whatever you say it is, right? So their goal is to help you get it to how you imagine it, and if your goal is to make it move, for example, and there are certain things you have to change. Some of the long philosophical parts, I work so hard on trying to be a fake philosopher. It's it's long. It's a long segment. Or, oh my gosh, that's so much research for this history. And it's yeah, but this is, if you want to write the history book, make it, So that's what I mean about the sort of skillful aspect of that element of it. So anyway, I just want to make sure I point that out. That success, to me, is really it's a collaborative experience, even though it feels like it's not. That's part of the magic of fiction writing. So another hand.
Yeah, I'd encourage you to read the acknowledgments.
Yes.
It's quite lengthy.
Use the mic for the recording. I don't know if it's matters.
I'm not sure, but you have another hand back here, so if you want to use it.
Thank you so much, Ousmane. I'm Sons of Light.
Yeah.
And this morning in her sermon, Reverend Anna referred to that, and the gospel reading, which is interestingly enough from Matthew,
Yeah.
you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. So I'm thinking, first, well, why would that group be called Sons of Light as a white supremacist, racist group? And then perhaps it's to shed light on it, maybe that's why you chose the name, so that there is light, it's trying to be open, it's not hidden in the way that it might be in another era, because it is so open in our society right now. So I'm just wondering if
No, it's a great question. So the Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness goes back to like Middle Ages, sort of Christian, sort of like this emergence of groups of people that were trying to articulate, sort of ideas about Christianity. And so when I was sort of researching and thinking about a group of people, and also Matthew, hence Matthew Strong as a character, so the book of Matthew is really important in it. That literally is why I chose to name it Sons of Light, because there's been other organizations similar to that. Then you go back to the Middle Ages, and it's like the sort of Sons of Light, Sons of Darkness, a lot of play on that. And so religious, so that's why I chose it. It wasn't random, it was connected directly to that. But the bigger arc really also connected with work that linked a lot of the sort of Nazi mysticism. So like German mysticism, I was reading a lot of that, and so the connections between ideas around, so what they did was they dug up a lot of these sort of middle-aged, groups, and like tried to find connections to reinforce their sort of ideas. And so I became sort of interested in those efforts and seeing that pairing, because there's a lot of pairing between like white supremacy, Nazi ideology, and that link in the book, but also more broadly, because it's actually just true. And so those are some of the elements that I was interested in. And so it is so the Sons of Light is like some of these things are only now in the book, like just mentioned that like he had a parish, Matthew Strong, and like, it's like literally situated like a Christian right, white supremacy sort of situation. As a minister, he's called a prophet by his like followers. So they do see him in that way. And so that's why sort of that was important to it. But it's interesting when you have a really long book, you edit it down, and elements, subparts are like cut out. So some of it isn't fleshed out, because what became important as the book evolved was the thriller element of it. And so some of his backstory and his parish and things like that are just mentioned sort of in and afterwards. So yeah, good question. Yeah, other comments too?
Yeah, just a couple of things to say. I don't know your name, lady over there, but I'm a fiction writer myself. Some of you know I taught at the high school here for 20 years. I'd always get that, fiction. It's not real. Is this real fiction, And I give him something like Uncle Tom's Children. He says, how can that really happen? By Richard Wright, his first book. It's got some horrific lynching stories in it. But for me, what I once said was, and people got this a little better, is that you can have all the history you want, but fiction gives you the emotional things that were going on during that history. So in Beloved, it's the horror that she experiences. And my frustration for years has been the sort of categorizing black literature in its own place, Oh, that's all political stuff. We don't want to hear about that. As opposed to family and relationships and religion and belief. So, I bought a bibliography for you all, and it has it's like the do-it-yourself Black history through literature class. So you can read all these novels that people don't talk about or use. I mean, when I was a student at San Francisco State in 1968, we did a study of the curriculum, which is probably still true. There were 50 courses with 500 books. There were 2 books by Black writers. Native Son, and Invisible Man. And in each of those, there's a man who's the star of the book, and by the end of the book, he's either dead or going to jail for life. So you have to understand what's going on here in a way. But on a lighter note, I want to congratulate you, Ousmane. You don't know about this yet, but a committee of us, including myself, have just sent your book to the nomination to Reykjavik, Iceland. They do an annual award for the best, most insane scene in the first 3 chapters that's never been done before. Unprecedented. So you're reading along in the book, and all of a sudden, Allie is being stuffed into the trunk of a car by Matthew Strong, and she's arguing with him about it. And like, I have a friend who read the book and called me up and said, "This guy is nuts. He's nuts." I said, "Okay, Jimmy, but does it work?" So for all the theory and this and that and craft stuff, the ultimate thing in fiction comes down to, does it work? So congratulations on that.
There's definitely intertextual elements of, when I say intertextual, what I mean is that when you look at the quotes by people, and if you were to read those whole entire speeches or essays, or very much speaks to my own sort of African American literature, right? And sort of thinking about the works that influenced my own writing, And so I've written, you already know this. He's read, I think pretty much all besides one, but I've written 4 novels. This is the first one I've published, and so I've been writing novels my whole life, and I've been influenced by the sort of questions that African American literature take up. So those of you, if you have not taken a course of African American literature, I will say that elements of family, right, and sort of thinking about, one's struggle around religiosity, leaving the community, and sort of like taking opportunities, these have been really important. The relationship between slavery and the contemporary moment has been one of the defining features of African American literature for a long time. And so that was really important to me to take, to sort of go back to the tradition of the slave narrative, right? So some of the early black writer, Douglas, Harriet Jacobs is, sort of in here, Stuart Truth, and looking at the sort of African American literary tradition and attempting to engage in some of those themes and ideas, sort of as Ernie suggested. I mean, in order to speak in conversation as opposed to, not as opposed to anything, I guess, just to sort of be in conversation, because those are all these works influenced my thinking and my choice to write these books, right? And so Angela Davis's I don't know if people have read Angela Davis's autobiography. Has anyone read that at all? 72. I teach Davis's autobiography. I teach Assata Shakur's autobiography. I have taught Elaine Brown's, who's in the Black Panthers, and so the contemporary autobiographical tradition coming out of the 60s is very important to shaping the sort of pacing and some of the themes as well. And so, I look forward to, those that are interested in that. Actually, I'm giving a talk at UMass, and so we're doing, in a few weeks with some of my mentors and stuff, and so that'll be maybe the first time I really sort of engage the questions around African American literature in that sort of way. So, yeah, thanks for the comment, Ernie. And for nominating for an award. Ernie calls me up and he's like, "Hey, there's an award I think you should send your book into." I'm like, so anyway, in my list of my awards. Other comments, questions? Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to say I really appreciated the fact that the people in the book are very complicated.
Okay. Yep.
Because you talk about thrillers.
Yeah.
A lot of times you have a thriller, the people are very black and white in their feelings. And Allie was complicated, her student who disappeared was complicated.
Yeah.
Matthew Strong was complicated, and I think that really made it even more interesting and really pulled you in because we're all complicated.
Absolutely.
So that was really great.
Yeah, talk about that.
I don't think that speaker's on.
Oh, it's on?
Oh, there it is, okay.
Thanks. Yeah, so, I've learned a lot the last few years about characters and thinking about characters. And one of the lessons that I learned, thinking about that notion is because early on, Allie was my hero. Like, I'll just straight up. Like, Allie was like my hero. Like, it was like Angela Day. I took all like the sort of heroes and, you know, I was like, this is the heroine, right? You gotta, you know, slay the dragon. So you create this. And I remember my friend Trent is a writer, and, you know, it was one of the early times I sort of had a group of people read early sections. And Trent, he's like, Ousmane, Allie is like too good. Like, she's like, she won this, she won that. I was just like, yeah, why is that bad? You know? And, you know, and Trent was the one who really helped me understand that, you know, the value in trying to really think about, just the reality of us. That we have our heroes and we like to write our heroes, but at the end of the day, people are more interesting when when what we learn about them actually is about things that are not great and haven't gone well. So I've actually learned that in terms of character development, just thinking about that. Matthew Strong was easier in a sense because, you know, it's like you hate him, like, and you're just like, why would I even? So, but then the challenge was like, okay, not even so much like humanizing him or making him not terrible, but I decided that I wanted him to be that person, and I was sort of embodying and writing him, of like him really wanting you to understand his viewpoint. You know, like really, I'm desperate for you to believe me, get me, and show you I'm right. And I think that through that may have made him more vulnerable, or just, you know, made him one where, I mean, you know, some reviewers are like, oh, he's one-dimensional. I'm like, well, you know, it's from Allie's perspective. It's like, it's like a first-person novel. Because if it's third person, you can get in his head, and you can sort of like, you know, have scenes just with Matthew Strong. But when you write in first person, it's only, you only know what Allie knows. So like, if Allie doesn't know his inner thoughts, like, then you, the reader, can't know it. And so it ultimately leads the other characters to have less dimensionality. And so, yeah, I tried as best I could to give him little aspects of his character that would make him feel more realistic, and that effort to really convince everybody, and the reader even, that he's justified and right maybe is what part of what made him feel like more complicated and nuanced, because you know, sometimes people who are zealots or, you know, like, oh, okay, they're passionate. So, and then all the other characters are just really hard to differentiate, and you know, just getting help from people and readers to get it so the other characters, you know, are realistic and feel like it's their world. Because again, that's the problem with first person, is that you know, you don't have as much of a chance to give people broader dimensionality, because it's just ultimately whatever the character says about, you know, your narrator, you know, it's what they know about them. So yeah, character. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
So Allie is definitely my hero as well.
Oh, great. She's still with her.
Well, and you know, you poured your own understanding as an academic into her. I mean, you know, the former activist who, you know, decided she can't stand up for Cynthia when she loses her scholarship, and the marital problems. I mean, she's really complicated but wonderful heroine. You know, and I agree that Matthew Strong too, much as I hate him, is fascinating in a way. And you know, he does this sort of push-pull. There's that scene in the field, which is kind of brilliant, where he's sort of sympathetic, and then he turns monster again. Which there's some great moments between the two of them. I have to confess, I was really afraid you were going to sacrifice Odessa, so I'm sorry when you didn't. Thank you. And sort of a long digression to two questions. One is, at what stage did the title come to you?
Okay.
And the second one is, what's the next novel?
Okay, so the first question is immediately. Professor Matthew Strong, first blush, first page, July 15, 2007. I have the notebooks. I should have brought the notebooks. I like to bring the notebooks so people can see. I handwrite my drafts. So I have 3 notebooks, the Confessions of Matthew Strong. So, confession. Crucial in academic literature, Confession Nat Turner, being the most prominent one. So in some ways, early on, I was interested in my mind of like, you know, a white version, like sort of like a zealot, insurrectionist, which again, the side note is that so many things in the novel, you know, it's like it happened. It's like, you know, sort of like a version. It's like, when I was first working on this, I was like, I remember thinking, well, I don't think anyone's going to believe that someone actually would have an insurrection and take over. And I was like, that element, I was like, I just don't, and I was so unsure for so long, and I kept it in as a motive, and then and I was like, you see, like January 6th, my publisher called me, she's like, oh my gosh, it's just like in your book. And I was like, I knew with it, the group there are people who really do actually think they can take over the United States government, like, and really do that. And also Michigan, these armed militias like went into the, so it's like, so I had that in there. So that's, and then Herschel Walker running for governor, like black conservative football player. I was like, that's my main character. Like, just so many things like that end up happening. So Matthew Strong was originally, because I was interested in that fear, because I really, this was that novel. It was like the novel that was about fear, and so that's how it came in. And so and the question that drove the novel though was, whose confession is this though? Is it Allie's confession or is it Matthew Strong's? Right? So it should just really be the confession of Allie Douglas, because as we get to the end, we start seeing why she's telling us this story, right? So I was writing in the confessional narratives or black narrative tradition, and so that's why it was important to have that as a title. That's the reason why I could have sort of was in my mind before I wrote it down, because I knew that I was interested in engaging those questions, sort of that idea of Paul, sort of the confession, like how do you believe, and the idea of belief. That was all critical to the DNA.
So don't forget true confession.
Say it again?
Don't forget true confession.
Yeah, it's the early sort of genre of, absolutely, and that's the early genre of, I talk about that in my class, sort of, the 1700s, right, 18th century, sort of confessional coming out as a literary genre was really sort of important, as like an early book, people would buy these like confessionals, right, and so, yeah, it's a really, really great question. I think I answered, so I'm in a little bit of a dilemma. So I wrote a novel. I have two completely finished novels, and I have a third handwritten finished novel. But there's particular scenes that I have not written in, and I sort of want to write. So one novel, my first novel, was about a coming-of-age story called Talent, about a black kid from the suburbs who's a lacrosse player. Goes to college. And sort of has this sort of experience, sort of coming of age, being an athlete, and just talent, and all that stuff. So that was my first novel. My second novel I wrote was a play on Richard Wright's Native Son. And so it's like an updated Native Son, set in New York. My character is named Trigger, instead of Bigger Thomas. And part of the reason it's a play on it, and this goes back to my father. My father, one of the things he did really well is provoke me. And during one of our many long arguments about literature and life and history and all that stuff, he's like, I was criticizing Native Son. And I was like, it's not a great novel. It's not a great novel, right? And because of the last third, it's like, we're in the courtroom for the entire thing. It's like, so it's a complete piece. I just don't think it's a great novel, okay? I mean, not impact on the world, yes, awesome, but just like literary for lyricists. And so he's like, yeah, well, if you think you do better, write another one. And I was like, I'll show you, I can. It's like you guys shoot for the moon, right? And so I wrote that novel because I really just feel like Bigger 2 is really one-dimensional, and so my character Trigger's way more complicated. Like when you first meet him, you meet Trigger and you see Bigger Tom, you see the thug, the hood, set in New York City, drugged, all that stuff. But then as the novel unfolds, you begin to realize that no, this character is not anything like you think, right? And so it plays on that. I'm from New York City. I work with kids from New York City, for 23 summers. And so I've seen a lot of kids, young people, 13, 14, who are really like my character, like Trigger, from the sort of tough part. And so I wanted to devote time to it. So I spent a lot of time on that novel, and I love it. And so I sort of want to go with that one. But this other one that I think I'll probably do next is it's called Black, and it's about a character, Guy Thomas Black, who's sort of like Malcolm X. He's like Malcolm X character, Fred Hampton, who is assassinated in the 60s, so it's 69. But at the start of the novel, it turns out he may have lived. So my character, who's like this conservative, political science theorist who like did a dissertation about like critiquing Black Power, like critiquing Thomas Black, now has to go figure out if he's still alive. So the novel takes you on this journey to see like, is he still alive? And like, because of travel novels, like he travels and he's like searching down. He like doesn't believe he's still alive. He's like conspiracy theory. He's like needs to prove it. And so the novel takes you on a journey. And I won't tell you if he's still alive or not. He might be alive. The evidence is from like the 80s, and maybe like, oh, he wrote these letters in the 80s. Like, wait, how could he have lived through this thing? And so through the novel, you like learn like the backstory and the mayor of New York City and sort of like the corruption and what led to the assassination, all those things through that novel. I love all my novels, like y'all who have 4 children, like you love all your children the same. So I love all my novels the same, and so I still need to decide which one I really want to spend my attention to, because you have them written, but then it's like, you know, you go through your editor and you get to like sort of like figure out what they're interested in. So yeah, you see like these are all common things in my novels, right? Like they all share, because it's me, right? It's me writing them, so they all share my history, love of place and things like that. So wow, give a long answer. Sorry, everybody. Other questions? I think there was a hand over here. Yeah, hey. And then this one over here. Yeah.
I'm interested to talk a lot about the process to go through, both on your behalf, on your own behalf, and how important it is to get everybody else's insight, which can change things dramatically.
Yeah.
What about the characters themselves? Do they speak to you?
Yes. Okay.
You hear their voices?
That's a great question. So I do hear voices. I thought all writers did. Then I went to and got my master at Columbia, and turned out I was like one of the few people that does. I'm like seeing these workshops, these like brilliant young writers, and I'm like, wait, you all don't hear voices? The characters talk to you? They're like, so I literally, when I'm like, you know, I describe it as like, they want to tell their story to me and explain things, so like they talk to me, and like I hear them, and it's like, okay, and so literally like the dialogue and stuff is like people, it's all process for me, getting a piece of paper quickly to write out like what I'm being told, or being guided, you know. From a Christian point of view, obviously the Holy Spirit is very important to me, and you know, perhaps that's a gift, and that's why I have the gift to write books and write fiction. You know, that's a great explanation, you know, for me. But I absolutely do short stories too, and they, you know, it's really, really strange because when that movie, that movie came out, Sixth Sense. Do you guys remember that movie where it's like the character could like hear dead people, and when I saw that I was like, oh my gosh, that's so weird. That's like me. Like I hear these people talking to me. So anyway, yes, that's a great question. It's true, actually. I really do. And that also makes it hard to edit, because like editors are like, oh, like that's not realistic. I'm like, say. And then like the writing dialect, like if it's in set, like it's not really accurate, but like that's how I sort of heard it with an accent. So Toni Morrison used to say that she used to make her students write about things they know nothing about on purpose to help them train their. And so like if I was I'd be in trouble, because I like always write about things that I love and things that I'm interested in. I haven't written any novels or books that like about with characters that like are, you know, completely not really necessarily like anything I've experienced. And I don't know if that's bad or good or whatever, but I need to get these other novels out. So anyway, other questions. So there's 1, 2 more if you're willing. Yeah, keep going. Absolutely.
Sure. Susan, you've been waiting.
I was wondering, on the culture war spectrum, how do you decide to make Matthew go towards the secret and closed group versus somebody who, like Ron DeSantis, has got a bigger audience that he's trying to convince? You know, where do you pick to make him believable? How big his circle is that he's going to throw around to get his point of view across.
Yeah, no, I was really inspired by how successful, you know, a lot of people who veil their beliefs as not being sort of white supremacists, how influential they've been. And they've been really influential, particularly young people. That's why it's in the book. You know, a lot of the sarcasm and the memes and these things are very seductive. And I think that the audience is much bigger than we think who are receiving this sort of content and this version where it's like, you it's almost like part of it is believably true when it comes to history or whatever, but then there's one part, if you can read critically, you realize like, wait a second, like that interpretation like maybe logically might make sense, but it's not based on what like scholars say. And so that was really important to the book, to me, sort of to sort of engage in that question and to make it a part of the discussion that goes on with the students and with the teachers because that's still true around censorship and what people can say and what teachers can say in schools. And so my view about, just broadly speaking, is that we're always in the cultural wars. We're always engaged as teachers, at least, and maybe even people in the community, with those that think our ideas pollute the public mind or just disagree with them. And so I think that part of being an educator is to have a practice, to be able to articulate to parents, what you think and why you think, and then to help students be able to articulate that to their parents or other people who challenge what you're teaching, to help them understand how you got to that point where you're teaching that. I remember one time I was giving a talk or presenting at this humanities conference, and I just had mentioned that in my course I teach with adults, we read like the South Carolina Declaration of Secession. And then someone came up and was like, oh, I'm so surprised you read, I'm like, why would we not read, South Carolina seceded from, that's a pretty important document, or John Calhoun's argument for why slavery is justified. Of course the students should read that, absolutely, as opposed, but I think that the view was that, these people weren't teachers or anything, and they were surprised, and I think that that's the mistake, is to think that educating is not about, giving people everything and the tools and even ideas that we see as reprehensible should be engaged with. And I knew that writing this book would be one that would be challenging them for that reason, because some people would just not want to be interested in it at all, just because of what they heard the subject matter is. But I would hoped that it was the closest that you all would get to wanting to read and understand that perspective, maybe, than going and reading the secondary books around which I've read many, around white supremacy or racial thought, etc. That may not be interesting at all. Maybe through my book, you sort of get that's kind of reduced aspect of what those views are. So that's a lot of my interpretation of the question and my response to your comment and question. So hopefully.
Hey, I appreciated how you made connections to the contemporary struggle with Black Lives Matter movement with the younger, and then Allie's nephew, and the kind of climate that they were dealing with. And I'm also reading another book right now called The Third Reconstruction, which it just came out, and it does a lot of parallels between the first Reconstruction and defining the second one. Yes, as the 60s, and then now that we're in a third Reconstruction, which I found those patterns really present in your book, of course, with the original, setting in the South right after the Civil War, and Birmingham and the New South and all of that. By the way, I'm from Mississippi. You might. So anyway, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that and kind of the role of fiction in helping people to understand the human realities of kind of the dynamics we're living in.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question. So, real quickly, Neil Joseph, who's an intellectual writer, historian, wrote a book, Third Reconstruction, to really look at this third iteration that we're in. If the second Reconstruction sort of was in the civil rights era, this one being more contemporary. I teach a course on from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, and in that course, I designed that course based on a lot of the research I did for this to really help my students understand the ways in which during this era, this moment, right, which some of us like, but for them, they were born in 2002. So this is their era, right? This is, everything else is history or whatever, to help them see more directly those parallels, because I've been very interested in those. And so in the novel, this engagement, is central to Black Lives Matter, which people, I saw it as a social movement immediately. Some people were like, oh no, it's a fad. I was like, I don't think it is. It has all these telltale signals. The choice to go after symbols of the Confederacy is fascinating, right? Because those have been attacked forever. Like Black Americans have been like, how are there statues to Robert E. Lee forever? And then the 60s was like, and then Black Power, and people were saying like, how are these still there? And so it's interesting that this generation chose that, and that they won, like that they were successful. Seeing them take down the Confederate flag, and in South Carolina, like it's just shocking to some of us who've been like, I don't know why they flew in Mississippi for that long anyway. Like, how could they fly the Confederate flag or the battle flag? And so this is an example of how this contemporary movement has actually had tremendous success at forcing our nation to confront and deal with issues, symbols specifically, that represent white supremacy, articulated as such. There was no embarrassment, and even in the 50s, around white supremacy in the Democratic Party and in the South. That people weren't embarrassed about that. They're like, yeah, this is the right order. And so in my work, and this is what's great about fiction, right? Because it's really hard to write contemporary histories and write sort of narratives, and but being a novel, I can really, hopefully, skillfully, put in a lot of things, and so putting in them, spray painting Black Lives Matter or whatever on a statue that's coming down, and them being like it's coming down, whatever, that. Those sort of inner debates allowed Allie and others and readers to really think about sort of intergenerational aspects of what does it mean to be a citizen and to be in a community and to respect your elders and respect their institutions, right? But then at the same time, every social movement tends to be young people challenging their elders. And so that element was really important to me as the book evolved over time. Do you know what I mean? Over time, as I kept rewriting, and you got to broaden out this, the South more, and I kept being challenged to broaden out the story. It just seemed to make sense to really include the contemporary debate because it was already a factor in the story. But I just, lifted up his nephew Devon. I sort of lifted up the scenes and made them come alive and stuck Allie awkwardly in those scenes, which I thought was really fun to poke fun at her because, we're academics. I started off teaching high school. My first teaching job was in 4th and 5th grade, combo class, as teacher assistant. And so I never worked with young people, but many of us, haven't had that experience. Great question. Was there one more though over here? A final one? One more? Yeah. Get a final
Right
one.
here, and I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was really interested in your development of William Jefferson.
Okay,
The nephew, I think, of
Yeah.
Mrs. Jefferson donating the money.
Yeah.
And, I could see early on that he was kind of contributing to whatever extremist was out there. We didn't know that Matthew Strong was his name.
Yeah.
But there was something going on.
Yeah.
And as it developed, it seemed like, okay, he's sort of a sub-villain because of his collaboration kind of going along in the vision of the New South and all that.
Yeah.
And then, towards the end, it seemed like you had that great quote from James Baldwin about he who collaborates goes to hell or something like that. And I figured, well, and I want to ask you, and spoiler alert, my question may reveal something that people who haven't read the book, but clearly I saw him as a more kind of active collaborator because he had communicated with Matthew Strong.
Yeah.
But I just was curious, did he die and go to hell at the end? or did you leave it mysterious, or was I reading late at night and I, missed that page?
Yeah. So one of the things I really liked about, as I began to sort of develop out and sort of figure out this world, this other world that Allie begins accessing, does have to do with, I think, a huge myth and temptation that people have who sort of collaborate with, with really maniacal and conniving people who are really bad, is that they can control them.
Yeah.
And so the cousin is like, oh yeah, he's just restoring houses, and we're still sort of really conservative, and I don't like. I think black people are fine. Sort of like, it's like that, and the way in which it suddenly turns out that no, he's not running it. Actually, Matthew Strong is running everything, and using him became really important to, I think historically, because that's how, it's always been, and again, I hate to overplay Germany, but it's like, it's like people get elected in, and people think, oh yeah, we can, control this, and but that person is a sociopath. Like, they've been manipulating the entire time, and you can't control them. And so for me, and I remember, I get, sort of the critique of like, I remember people being, it's not believable, and I understand like why, he's like, comes into Alley, and I'm like, yeah, because that was important to me, like, to understand that he thought he was running things, but actually, no, he wasn't, ever. He thought that Matt Strong was the thug who was going to take care of this, and meanwhile, Matt Strong had a plan that was way outsmarted him. And so suddenly he, just like the, Tommy Turner, who knew they knew each other, soon you sort of realized that, like, even Tommy Turner, like, thought, like, oh, I got the money from this person, and it's like, but he didn't know Matthew Strong was even involved. Like, he didn't know who this like, thug was, like, sort of, this, and suddenly, everything gets turned, and so that, that line was really important for me to develop, because I do think that is sort of real, right? People donate to organizations, and they feel like maybe the issue is like a certain book you think is offensive, or things got taken too far with Black Lives Matter, or things are, and then suddenly you're donating organizations, but really that's like only the tip of the iceberg for these organizations. Like, really their agenda is like way much further. In the digital world, it can happen faster, right? Where you just donate and you read a little bit, and you don't get to look at people's faces and see like what their agenda is at the rally, who's there, as it was before. And I think in some ways the stealth nature of these organizations and their influence, we've sort of seen the results in some ways. Because did anyone like think about like when like Ku Klux Klan members stopped speaking on campus? Does anyone remember like when that happened? Do people remember back in college when like someone would come on, the neo-Nazi party, because I remember Carolina, like people would come, I went to UNC, and, they were allowed as freedom of speech, and like it was still somewhat, but then, there became a point where it stopped in the 90s, and what's his name, lost the election from Louisiana, who was like, ran, what's his name,
Duke?
Yeah, David Duke. And then it was like with David Duke, it was like it was like the end in some ways, like where you sort of had this like legitimacy, and then anyone who was like caught ever wearing a Klan suit, like was suddenly like shamed in the media, like the 90s and 2000s. We'll go back to old yearbooks, and and so it was like gone for a while, and alt-right began to sort of like re-emerge as this sense of like, put the sheets away, it's embarrassing. That doesn't work. We have to like, and then all of a sudden, we have a president who's like, no, screw all that. Let him in! Let everybody in! You're like, what? Like, are you serious? Like, after a generation of keeping out those with extreme ideas, suddenly it was like, oh yeah, well, some people think their ideas are extreme, but he's a nice guy. You're like, oh my gosh, that's the standard? And so what's been interesting over the last few years, this goes back to sort of like the novel, like, has like, what has emerged, which is terrifying, is like a legitimacy around people with, they just have like ideas, and all ideas are the same value. I'm like, no, I don't think that's true. I think ideas that are racist, homophobic, sexist, ideas that promote violence are not like equal with ideas of like peace and the beloved community. Like, no, I actually don't believe that, people can have whatever ideas they want, but I don't think like equal in my sense of morality and ethics. But what's been really interesting is the way things have been framed around that way. And so that's a long way of saying just that the complexities we're able to touch the surface because it's through Alley, but in my mind, in sort of like broader narrative and book, like that whole world of that private school and the history of that school and the connection to the statue and the family, like all that stuff's rooted in, like, it's true, it's rooted in history. I just changed the names, so it's like, it's okay for it to be Birmingham, because, it's Birmingham, right? But like, sort of like, I don't want to like name like real people or things because the families are still alive. It's going to Mississippi, Alabama, like, these families, so I went to look for the families of the slaveholders inspired with my daughter this summer. So we were trouncing around in like, Jefferson County, looking for these like graveyards and the most prominent family their family graveyard was actually moved when they built Bessemer Highway. So they had to like move this graveyard to this other spot. And I just thought about like, wow, like this is exactly what Matthew Stokes was talking about. It's like, here are the most prominent people in the county, you know, in the state, and it's like, you know, 150 years later, it's like, oh, well, you know, their land had been well sold off by then, and the world really had turned around, and suddenly, you know, they're sort of like in this, like, it was like a used car dealership, and like a highway, and I had Amani, we're like in like, looking at the gravestones, like trying to find like this family. It was my brother called me, he was like freaked out, it was like so surreal from Paris. It was like, wow, this is so, because we had the phone out taking photos. And so, yeah, that's sort of what I'll say at the end is that, you know, one of the benefits of fiction, the benefits is that you can bring things together, but I didn't want to use actual names, nor did I want a white supremacist to suddenly like become famous. My novel blows up, like this famous person. And that's what's great about doing fiction, is you can, you know, mask it intentionally in ways that, that still speak to the overall purpose. So much of that world is actually really rooted in my research, and all the family members and lineages, actually there are people who, I mentioned in the acknowledgments, a new book came out that helped me a lot in 2017 about this history, so in Alabama specifically. Yeah. All right, well.
Before we break up, I'd like to add one promotional message. The Power of Truth festival that's coming up. Please consider this. It's I think it's April 29th, 30th at the Bombing Center. And Ousmane will be there. He's one of the organizers and one of the speakers.
Say it again, what is it called?
It's the Power of Truths Festival.
So real quick plug, Power of Truths. Last year is our first year, is our second year, and the goal of this sort of conference festival is to bring together artists, activists, intellectuals, educators to our community, which is an incredible community of history and everything, to sort of talk about, what the works they're doing to engage social justice issues. And the reason why we sort of came up with this is that many of us go to conferences, they're just singular, right? So it's like scholars go to these conferences, educators go here, there's activists conference. And so we wanted to have one, because we're such a rich community, and I mean that like statewide and regional, to bring together so people could go to sessions on art at the same time, sessions on history, and all in one place. So that was the principle behind it, and we brought it back from June to soon, so expect more announcements. It would be great to get, do things around Christianity or, questions that people have been wrestling with, in this parish around racial justice. I think that would be a great panel to talk about how do you keep momentum going around these issues, now, it's 2023. And I know I said that to a parent who asked me, who's just started, because some places, just started a racial justice support group for parents and with the kids, and she was like, I'm sort of on my own, and it was after a talk I gave a few weeks ago, and I was like, I encourage the same thing, like let's get 4 parent groups together. They're trying to do this work to come to the conference and really engage in conversation about how to keep momentum going. And so I encourage all of you to not only come but participate, and I'll be sure to get some invites and a press release, and also just like proposals. So we're just trying to get all that stuff together now.
Well, thank you, Ousmane. Once